All right, let's talk about Companion, a much maligned mechanic, mostly because of its performance in standard and, well, not just standard, in all constructed formats, except EDH, I believe, because the mechanic does not work in EDH. But Companion is really funky stuff. This is the stuff of custom magic laboratories where people are trying to figure out ways to have cards that you play from outside the game or that can start with from outside the game. And Wizards went there. Two interesting components that they married together, in my opinion, with Companion. First being that you have this extra card that you get for free, something from outside the game. That it feels transgressive in a similar way that I was saying earlier, um, but it also has a deck building cost. It asks something of you, which I think is fair in a very interesting way. I'm more of a Johnny player than the other types and the other psychographics. And so that really appealed to me to be able to immediately get this reward for building my deck a certain way. I mentioned that deck building is my favorite component of Magic, the way that the game is designed to really reward deck building and to make that an interesting aspect of the game. And I like that Companion does that. I don't like all of the companion requirements. Like I like some of them more than others. Some of them just feel very incidental and don't really match the card designs themselves that well. But I found that the play pattern was very fun. It also ended up being broken and constructed, and I think that does fundamentally come back to the design of that. But what has your experience been with Companion in limited and in kind of your cube? Um, I
So
mean,
I
do you look at
loved
them for
Companion
cube?
Limited, and I put most of them in my cube until they changed what Companion did, and then I took them all out except Luris.
Yeah,
Uh, is the way they ended up changing it to add the whole pay 3 mana blah blah blah. I think that basically was equivalent to saying that you're never playing a companion ever again.
yeah,
And that
yeah.
that was really a bummer because I do think they're really interesting and limited. They're certainly very powerful and limited, but I
They
think
are.
that one of the best things you can do to add depth to a limited format is to have build around rares. And it is really hard to have build around rares. Like I can think of only a handful of them over time, and this gave you a whole bunch of them to play with.
And they're inconsistent to draw. Like, are you going to build your deck around a rare that you're only ever going to have one of in a draft and sometimes two that you may not draw? It might be in the bottom five cards of your deck, you know?
Right, so like Laboratory Maniac is one of the only ones I can think of because by definition, if you're doing the Laboratory Maniac thing, you intend to draw every card in your deck.
Right. Right. And the thing about Laboratory Maniac is it's not doing something different than what decks were already doing in that format. There was already a blue green deck that you want to mill yourself. There was already the spider spawning deck also. And so a lot of times you see these rare build arounds where they're just a different aspect or of a further approach on the other ways to build around that already exist within the set. Whereas with Companion, these can be rare build arounds that ask something completely different of you, and you know that you're going to get the payoff no matter what. It kind of solves an issue of build arounds that Trevor, I think, was talking a lot about in our Discord chat like a month ago or something, in a really interesting way.
Yeah, I wish they had just errated them to have type conspiracy. That
And
would
then they
have been
can't be in constructed ever.
right, and then they just can't touch constructed. Uh, because I again think like all the pluses are in fitted. I
Hmm.
think in constructed, the only way you were going to make them appropriate and constructed was to print so many of them that it was just understood that every deck was going to have a companion, but then they would all have different companions, and that was just never going to happen once people saw that every deck is going to have one of these two companions, and then you're going to basically know the entire thing.
Or to make them
Also,
all bad or like very fringe good, if that makes sense. So that if they only really work in one specific kind of deck that is maybe tier two at best,
Although that's just like asking to just miss by a little bit, and then suddenly everyone is playing this one thing as they have like I think
Yeah.
that's what they tried to do with Fires of Invention. They tried to make a card that did something that they know they're not supposed to do, but they tried to make it just bad enough that it would be like a fun tier 2 deck, and then of course they ended up having to ban it because they missed. Uh,
Yeah. Wait,
so
so in limited, companion changes in limited also, right? You have to pay the 3 mana?
yes, you have to pay the 3 mana in limited,
Ah,
which
that
just
kind of ruins the format a little. Well, I mean, it doesn't
it's
ruin the
just completely
format,
ruined.
but it ruins the mechanic a lot. I mean, my some of my favorite experiences drafting this set. I was doing a little bit of rare drafting because I was on Arena and I wanted to complete my collection as fast as possible. So that led to me, first picking a lot of companions, and it was really, really fun to navigate the draft, trying to only find even converted mana cost cards, which tended to be rampy things, which worked really well to ramp out Geruda, but also creatures with mutate. So even though they cost 4 mana, you can still use them at 3 mana to fill out your curve well, or activated abilities that would fill out your mana on turns that normally you wouldn't be able to. And it was incredibly powerful, but it was so difficult through the draft. I felt like it asked a lot of me, but rewarded me in a way that was fair and felt great in draft.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun in Cube drafting a red black Obosh deck, and that's when I finally understood why Obosh has the ability it does, because it seems very odd at first for the thing that cares about odd stuff to double damage, because doubling is basically like the opposite of odd, and I complained about this a lot at the
Right.
beginning. But then you realize one is odd, and so what kind of decks are going to play one drops? Aha, the decks
Yeah.
that are going to play Goblin Guide and Zergo and all of these other one drops. And so then you got this like mono red black aggressive deck or whatever. And so that was fun in Cube. Not so fun in Modern or Standard or any of the other places where it ended up destroying the world.
Yeah.
But I think part of the problem with Companion and why it plays so much better in Limited than in Constructed is that it intrinsically makes it so that your deck does the same thing every game. And
Yeah.
so playing a match where your deck does the same thing every game and your opponent's deck does the same thing every game, and then playing a bunch of matches of that and whatever, that's awful if it's
Yeah.
constructed. But in limited, it's really cool if you can make your deck do the same thing. Because that's sort of your goal in limited is to build a deck that does the same thing every time, and then just sort of see how your machine that does the same thing every time compares against your opponent's machine that does the same thing every time. So
That's true.
I think really this is a mechanic that is, or sorry, was perfect for limited when it was played as it was intended, and then just destroyed constructed. And so then they also destroyed it in limited. And so now it's just not a thing anymore.
So, two interesting questions I have about this. One was one that was raised by Mark Rosewater on Twitter, um, and he doesn't call out the companion mechanic specifically, but this was at the time when mechanic people were starting to realize, oh, mechanic is busted. Like we wizards plucked the forbidden fruit and they're force feeding it to us and ruining magic. And so he came out with this poll, and it says inquiring minds want to know while R&D tries to support innovation and balance, the two often fight with each other. Which of the two do you personally believe R&D should prioritize? And then there's a poll, and some pros, a lot of like magic personalities, and people who are big in the community. They didn't like this proposed dichotomy, like this proposed conflict between the two. Like we should have both every time, right? Like in the perfect world, we have to have both. And I don't want to speak for Mark, but I think he was saying like at some points in the process, from the design perspective, you can't chain yourself to only the safe ideas, right? Like that's how we get Return to Ravnica and Theros Beyond Death, and a bunch of workhorse mechanics that we know play well and are perfectly boring, and it feels like every Magic set we've ever played. Um, but do you remember that? Did you see that when this
Oh,
came
definitely.
out? But
I
what
will say
what were your thoughts?
I read a lot of the stuff that pro players printed that claimed that there is not a dichotomy here and found it thoroughly unconvincing. I completely agree with Mark that you really have to make a choice between these two things. And I mean, a choice isn't fair, but you have to weight these two things in your decision. And I would rather have Ikoria every year than have Ikoria every 15 years or whatever rate we're currently on for having this kind of thing. Like, Ikoria screwed things up in a way that they have to watch that they don't do as often. But the push for innovation, I think, is worth the trade-off these other things. Because again, I think both of us are on the page that we've had more fun playing Ikoria than we have in a long time.
Yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
and so I think that that is worthwhile. But it also goes to highlight, I think there's another Mark poll question about something like, is it okay if we print cards that play really well in format X, but destroy format Y, and then we have to ban them in format Y? I think
Hmm.
this is where you just run into the reality that Magic is a bunch of different games, and you can't
Yeah.
design for all of them all at once.
Magic is getting too big. And I think that's where you have to have these products designed for specific formats, um, which I don't love. But I think when you're doing that, I think that's where you have to spend a lot of that design space of like, okay, now we can do the stuff that would break standard but would innovate modern. Or like, now is where we need to do the stuff that would perhaps be broken in standard but would innovate commander or whatever. Um, and I don't know. I'm firmly on the side of innovation because it's not Mark's job to balance things. Like his priority should be innovation, but he's asking about the overall R&D. And when I was reading the public articles they put out about the process behind designing Ikoria, Dave Humphreys was talking about what his main priorities were in set design. And uh, it's interesting to me that both keyword counters and companion came from these hackathon things where they get people together and they say, this is a design problem or a design space, and we want you to stretch as far as possible and see what you can find. And both of those things came from that. And when Dave Humphreys, said companion could work well here, it's the idea of bonding with a monster. You have shared goals, and so you're working together, but you have to kind of compromise your deck to make it work. He when he handed it off to play design, he warned them like you need to be very careful here, and he had some line that I thought was very telling, uh, or perhaps it foreshadowed poorly. Let's see, companion. There are many concerns, and so he listed the concerns with how they designed it. The verifiable requirement was interesting to me. He says that they had to be requirements that were easily verifiable throughout a game, which was not something I'd considered, but I could see how that could have been a problem. Um,
I thought about that a lot. It does not seem easy to verify to me that your opponent has a legal Garuda deck. Like, I don't
that's
really
true.
want to do that in limited after every game because, of course, you have to. In limited, you really, if you're doing it in paper, which again, no one ever did, but if you do, you really have to do that after every game, not even after every match, because of course they could side in.
I think what he meant more was like if they're not obeying it, becomes very obvious. Like if they play a 3 mana card through the course of the game, like oh you're not doing the thing, like that this doesn't work. Uh, although I
I
guess is
suppose you don't actually look at their deck, but if they have, yeah, I guess they're I guess that makes sense. Yeah, the idea is like, okay, they can put a 3 mana card in their hand, but they can't ever cast it. So, uh,
yeah.
or cycle their Frostveil Ambush or whatever, and then you're like, aha, something has gone wrong.
Yeah. So I found the quote in the or not the play design, the set design article. He said, I encourage play design not to rush to any judgment on the mechanic and to put it through its paces. It was something I could pull out of the set later if it got old. It wasn't integral to the set structure, but play design grew much fonder of the mechanic than I'd hoped. Um, Play design was very confident in their ability to make it work. Now, this is an interesting thing. Like, we don't work for Wizards. We're not in there. We don't see what the process is. They talk a lot about it, but we're not really in the trenches with them. I wonder if it was more of a design transgression that should have been minded more by actual, vision and set designers as opposed to play designers. Like repetitive gameplay, I guess play design should know that repetitive gameplay is bad, right? Like that's something that they are already looking out for in play design. But it seems like play design, they're the ones that like green lighted it and did all the work to quote unquote fix it or to make it playable and not be too problematic. And I just wonder, I don't know. I guess I'm not wondering anything. I guess what I'm just doing is blaming play design right now, which is probably unfair. But it sure seems like that was the issue, right? Just the way the numbers were pushed. Or do you think it's just an inherent issue of the mechanic itself? Like, can this mechanic not be fixed or designed in a way that accomplishes the goals and creates the wonderful play patterns that you and I both love and limited, while still being something that happens in constructed, is interesting for constructed, but doesn't ruin it? Or is it like you say, they have to just be conspiracies? We have to say this is only in
Yeah,
limited
I
and
mean,
it's
I
not in
I
constructed.
think the right thing to do is to say these things are conspiracies. They replace basic lands in packs at the rate of whatever, whatever. And so every once in a while you get one of these. Your pack still has a rare that you could actually play, but it makes limited exciting and fun and
Hmm.
different or whatever. And so then you have this, and then you could do it every set in some format, and you could change it a little bit each time or whatever, and just spice up format to format. I think that would be great. I think there is no way to make it, and I think they're very well aware, as you say, this is obviously forbidden fruit that like Mark has been trying to, or Mark has played with the whole idea of card that starts in your starting hand every game and realize that like this is just a thing you cannot do because either you actually can play the cards, in which case that's bad, or the cards are unplayable, in which case what's the point? I think generally, if you find yourself in a place where you realize that if anyone plays the card, you've made a horrible mistake, which I think, for example, with Fires of Invention is another thing that falls in this category. But I think the whole companion mechanic does too. If anyone ends up playing these in constructed, we're host. There's no way that people are going to be happy if suddenly they're playing against Yori in every round. Uh,
Yeah. Well, I think that they did want them constructed, but I think they wanted them in like tier 2, maybe tier 1.5 decks, right? Like some of them are obviously built more for constructed than they are for limited. Like you can't draft around them, but you can build a deck for them. And there was some interesting, like my favorite companion is one that I haven't successfully built a deck for. It's Zerta the Dawnwaker, the one that requires that you have activated abilities. I had a lot of fun going through the standard card list and finding all of the cards that have activated abilities and seeing how I could abuse that with like adapt and other mechanics that require activated abilities that become really interesting and powerful when they're cheaper. But then there's other formats. I think like it's broken in some decks in Legacy. Um, it's just very difficult to balance that way. And I think it's still okay if these are just tier 2, tier 1.5 decks. But that requires even more play design work and play design balancing. And it's across many formats. And I wonder if this is just like flying too close to the sun. I love the initiative. I love the idea. I love the idea that this could not be broken. Like that was my hope because I enjoyed the design impetus here, despite maybe I'm just drawn to the forbidden fruit, right, of this. But I still kind of believe that they could have been costed a little differently or executed a little bit better, and it would have been a home run, or not a home run. Like it can't be a full home run when it's by nature a repetitive mechanic or one that introduces repetition to gameplay. But I think it would have gone over a lot better if we weren't playing against Urian decks every round, or Obosh in every aggro deck, or Lurus in every legacy deck. Like Lutri is not in any decks, but a tier 2 Lutri deck would be a fun thing to see, as a single deck in a top 8 in a tournament, right? Or there was an Umori the Collector deck that was like a blue green flash deck that also had Umori. Um, And that was interesting and fascinating. That was only a tier 2 deck. So like some of these companions are obviously okay, whereas other ones were just way too good, which means that is it necessarily the mechanics fault or just some of the executions of it?
Yeah, I think one thing that this has shown me, my original idea was, oh, well, if instead of 10 of them, there were 100 of them, that would fix it in constructed because there would be enough variety.
Well,
But
but then it'd be a requirement.
I think the well, yeah, I mean, you just I assumed it was going to be a requirement when they made the mechanic that you were going to have to pick your companion, and that it was just because it was just meant to be, oh, this is commander.
You were just kind of fatalistic about it. Like, oh well, the advantage is too good. All of the decks are going to have to do it. And I'm
Yeah, and
looking more from the other angle where I think they should have designed them so that they're a little more wonky and build around and only work in a few decks at a powerful level.
I didn't, to be clear, even think it was a bad thing. I think I said something in the our group chat that I'll confess that I was completely wrong. I said, like, now that the seal is broken, every Magic deck for all time is going to have something in the companion zone, and they're just going to have to print stuff to do that. And that was my view at the time, and I didn't think that was a bad thing because, well, people love their commander decks and they love their commanders,
Mm.
and so this is just going to be adding like one card to every 60 card Magic deck from here on out. And I thought, oh, that's fine. The problem that I didn't understand at the time was well put on Twitter, which was someone said something to the effect of, well, as soon as my opponent flips up their companion, before we've even shuffled and done hands, I know exactly what deck they're playing. And I know exactly what they're going to do. And I realize that's also true in Commander. As soon as someone shows you their rune Commander, I mean, you know exactly what their deck is going to be.
But in
Uh,
standard, you oftentimes know exactly what they're going to do just by which shockland they play on turn one. Just because you know what the tier one decks already are. You know what I mean?
I mean, at least you've made it to that. I mean, that's at least 5 minutes longer, given shuffling and
Yeah,
all of that.
I
You
guess
get to
that's
make it
true.
before you know exactly what your opponent's going to do. But in Commander, I think the savings isn't from the fact, or I think the thing that saves it is you're not playing one on one. I think
Yeah,
the
the
fact that it's
chaos
not
of
just I know what
multiplayer.
the rune deck is going to do, and I've played against a rune deck before, and I know what happens when I play my Locust God deck against the rune deck. It's going to play out like this, and I'm either going to win or lose because things is going to happen. It's, well, I'm playing this deck, they're playing this deck, and then she's playing that deck, and he's playing that deck. And so the multiplayer nature, I think, I'd never really appreciated this about Commander before, but the multiplayer balances out the repetitive gameplay that you have from the fact that you have a commander. And I think
Hmm.
I never appreciated that as a design element of Commander until seeing what happened with Companion.
Yeah, now that you bring that up, that makes sense, but I'd never thought of it that way either. Because multiplayer games automatically remove a lot of control in a way that feels bad. A lot of times, people used to playing one on one, but if you make up for that by guaranteeing your deck is generally going to do the play pattern you like consistently because of your consistent commander, it makes up for that a lot. So that's a fascinating point.
Yeah, I
Um,
think we were both optimistic about Companion, although we both were optimistic and you are imagining it playing out in different ways. And I
yeah,
think we were both too
we were
optimistic.
both too optimistic in both directions. I would agree with that. uh, yeah. Now I feel like they'll never come back to this forbidden fruit, or like you say, it'll be another 15 years, unfortunately. But I like that they were willing to do this, and maybe it's just because I saw it as an oasis in a desert of innovation. But I thought it did fascinating things to the draft, and I think it pointed to deck building in a way that I appreciate as a deck builder. So I kind of I put this in like the dredge bucket of mechanics, where dredge is really cool from a design perspective, but really bad in a like how it's developed and the actual play patterns and constructed and things like that. And I think it's the same with companion, unfortunately.
April King said, now we're going to be referring to Storm as an 8 on the Companion scale.
uh, that's good.
But
That's pretty good.
I'm glad they tried it. I mean, I'm sad it did not work out, and I'm sad that they did not put enough effort in to be able to try it and be able to iterate on it. I
Yeah.
think you're right that they needed to pull low enough that they were sure it wasn't going to break anything so that they could iterate on it and get it to the point where this is something they really could do in the long run. But yeah, I think you're right that yeah, this is probably not going to happen because players are going to be so scarred by companion that it's not going to be something they're going to want to mess with ever again.
Yeah, I would love to see the space explored with more like build around enchantment type things. But I think if you're using the commander zone, you probably want it on creatures. Like a lot of these read like build around enchantments because they have whenever abilities or, static things that behave like an enchantment. Um, I'd love to see them try it again sometime, but yeah, I don't see it happening soon, unfortunately. But that's the wonderful thing about Ikoria. It definitely has it has a big failure in companion that is still a beautiful failure in my opinion. Like I love the even the awkward things that don't work. Mostly because I'm not as invested in standard as probably the people most upset by companion are. So I have to admit that. But I do love the feeling of them flying too close to the sun. I think it's more fun than being too far away from the sun.
Agree. And in limited, it played well, and they
Yeah,
managed to get a card banned in vintage, which hasn't happened in like 20 years, right? So
yeah,
that's quite a thing.
yeah. And let's pretend it's a positive thing. Why not?